would you please welcome Michael to speak to us on Does Integrity Matter?
Now, with a subject like integrity, what I find fascinating is how so few people in our modern parlance truly understand even what the word means. When I speak in corporate settings, very often they've translated the word integrity into Latin, integritas, to try to give it gravitas, I guess. But that makes it even less understandable to who the people are there. And this is one of the problems when we're talking about things which are important and we're not even sure what the word itself means or signifies. I was speaking at a bank in London, and after I'd finished speaking, one of the senior partners there came up to me and said, "Michael, I want to tell you a story," he says, which happened to one of the other people here. He says, "I think you'll really like it." And what had happened is his son had been selected for interview at a very prestigious school in the United Kingdom. And the way the interview system works in this particular school is the boy is shown into the headmaster's study. The boy sits on one side of the desk. The son sits on the other side of the desk, and the father sits behind the son. So the father's in the room. He hears the whole interview, but all he can see is the back of his son's head. So he can't give any direction, but the idea is that they're present. And the interview seems to be going really well. And then the headmaster looks at this 12-year-old boy and asks him a slightly unusual question. He says, "Tell me, in all of this world, what is the thing that frightens you the most?" And the boy paused, sort of looked down at his feet, looked up and said, "Oblivion." And the headmaster was visibly struck with the profundity of this reply. Now the father is sitting in the back of the room panicking, thinking, why does my son live in terror of oblivion? Now oblivion, like most words, has shades of meaning. Okay? It can mean to cease to exist. It can mean to continue to exist, but no one to actually know that you exist. That's what politicians live in terror of. But however you interpret it, it's not good. The headmaster accepts the son shortly after this. This is the final question in the interview, and the headmaster at the end of it just says, listens to the son, so asks one more question, says, "Okay, we'll take you." And the father is now driving his son back home, and instead of celebrating, thinking, wow, isn't it incredible my son got into this great school, all the father can think about as he's driving along is my son lives in terror of oblivion. And so when they're halfway through the journey, the father sort of looks over to his son and says, "When the headmaster asks you what terrifies you the most, why did you say oblivion?" And the boy looked at his father like he was slightly crazy and said, "Well, that was the name of that really scary ride at the fun fair last week." Now, you see what happened. The headmaster detected a profundity in the boy's answer that actually wasn't there. And this is one of the challenges we sometimes face when we're dealing with these kinds of questions, is we have to make sure that we're, in some sense, talking about the same thing. Now, the word integrity, as we have it in English, comes from the Latin integritas, which means to be complete or whole. If you look up the Oxford English Dictionary definition of it, it will actually starts off with a series of negative definitions first, which is interesting. Undivided, unspoiled, sinless. So it offers negative definitions. Then it offers a positive one, to be whole, to be complete, to be integrated. And so when we're talking about integrity, what we basically mean is that there is a completeness, a wholeness to who we are in our very life. The challenge and the problem that many of us have as we go through life is our lives feel anything but integrated. They feel split. And very often we feel we have to be one thing in one context, another thing in another context, another thing in another. And far from everything feeling integrated and hanging together, everything seems to be split apart. So what I'd like to do, if I can, is raise a series of questions with you. And I'm going to use an outline that actually, I must confess, was actually developed by somebody else. Now, I don't think they're going to be too upset. They haven't used it for a while. Their name is Aristotle. He's been dead for a few years, and so, but he wrote a very well-known book called The Rhetoric. And in Aristotle's Rhetoric, he is looking at something slightly different. He talks about ethos, which we would colloquially call ethos, pathos, and logos. And he uses these three categories to think about basically any form of public rhetoric and speaking. But he starts off fascinatingly with ethos. And what he says is this. He said, whenever you listen to someone stand in front of you and speak to you and address you publicly, the question you should ask yourself is not, what is the ethic they espouse? The question you should ask yourself is, what is the ethic they live by? In other words, can you trust them? And this question of trust, who are we actually able to trust, has become one of the driving questions in the 21st century. We're finding it at every single level, whether it's in politics, whether it's in our education, whether it's in our business, whether it's in our family, who do we trust? So it leaves a primary question of who do we trust and are we trustworthy? Now, when we ask the question about does integrity matter? Is integrity important? Does integrity apply anymore? We're very tempted in this day and age to say something like, not really. But what we need to understand is the reason integrity matters is because it affects everything. Your friends are people you can trust. They keep their word, they keep their promises, and if you confide in them, you know they're not going to betray you. So we will talk about a faithful friend. We may talk about an unfaithful spouse, but however we phrase it, we're looking for trust. Every relationship we have important to us is regulated by trust. And that trust itself is a moral function of integrity. Can we actually trust them? Is it a good idea? Can we actually give ourselves to them in that way? Now, in the business world, we change that question a little bit and we'll say, look, that's really nice in family, but you can't afford to have integrity in business. Now, as soon as we say that, and we say, look, I can't afford any kind of moral thinking in my business world, we're already betraying something else. And that is that we do actually make moral decisions in businesses every day, normally multiple times. It's not that we don't do business with people we feel we can't trust. It's that rather we demand a higher rate of return to justify the increased investment risk related to that investment decision. So it's not that we don't make moral judgments, we do. People are making them multiple times every single day, but we do it subconsciously. And the trouble with subconscious reasoning is that we never take long enough to actually think, what is the basis I'm doing, and is it actually very sound? So the reason integrity matters is it governs every form of important relationship we have, whether it's in business or whether it's in family. We're making those things. So the first series of questions that come to us, which really stop and make us think, are we trustworthy? Where do we get our ethics from? Are they any good? How do we apply them? How do we think these things through? And those are the questions I'm asking you. Now, what's even more intriguing is when you start to think about it from another angle, you also begin to realize that there isn't a single organization in the world that doesn't have ethics and morals at its center. Not a single one. Now, if you don't believe me, go and join the mafia. And after you've joined them, you try lying to them, cheating from them, stealing from them, or betraying them. You will find they have a very highly developed sense of right or wrong, and their compliance department is unlike anything else you've ever encountered up until this point before. The question is not, do ethics and morals apply? The question is, how big a circle do we put them in? Within the family, within the mafia, the circle is drawn around the family. Within that circle, morality and ethics are absolute. You fail there, you may not live to tell the story, but outside the circle, you can do whatever you want. The question isn't, are morals and ethics at the center? The question is, how big a circle do we draw? Do we draw the circle just around us, around our family, around the corporation, around our city, around the country, around the world? How big a circle do we actually draw? One of the reasons why, sadly, we're now faced with so many ethical questions and we're struggling to even begin to think how we can answer them in a meaningful way is we actually thought these things weren't important. But the more you stop and think about it, the more you realize actually they're everywhere. You can't escape from them. They're at every single level of our society. A short while ago, there was a TV program called Lie to Me. And I don't know if any of you saw it. It was a fascinating program. It was based on the real-life research of what was an Oxford academic who then went off to the States. And what this academic did, which I found utterly fascinating, was he did his research on people's facial expressions when they're speaking to you. And what Dr. Paul Ekman realized was that regardless of your culture, your background, your history, when we lie, there's a universal set of expressions on our face. And if you can learn to read them, you can recognize when someone's lying to you. Which is why if you watch a modern, say, spy movie, you'll see cameras zoomed in on people's eyes and the corners of their mouths and various other facial muscles, looking for these telltale signs. Are they lying? Now, now the funny thing is sadly, this program Lie to Me got cancelled after 2.5 seasons. And I was once speaking in America, and I was saying, I want to give you a quote from this program, and sadly they cancelled it, and I'm really missing it. And a guy came up to me and said, I was the producer for that show. I said, you were? I said, why did you cancel it? He said, because the only people who watched it were people like you. He said, people who wanted to think when they're watching TV. He says, there aren't enough of you out there. And this just goes to reinforce one of my own personal pet theories, that the total amount of intelligence in the world is fixed, but the population's been growing. Now, what Paul Ekman says at one point, and you would expect him, having spent his entire life studying how to detect a lie, you would think he would give some thought to the consequence of lying. And he has, and this is, let me just read to you one of the things he wrote. He said, trust is a matter of faith, that the person you trust won't exploit it. Intimacy in close working relationships, romance and/or friendship requires and in fact depends on trust. Yet it is well known that the last person to realize that he or she is being betrayed is the person suffering the betrayal. Why? Because the betrayed person's trust blots out all recognition of the signs of the benign breach of faith, all the signs that everyone else so easily picks up on. We don't want to learn that our trust is being betrayed, that the person we hired is embezzling, that our children are stealing money from our purses. It's terrible to discover that our trust is being misgiven, and consequently, some of us will willfully avoid any clues to its discovery. Once trust has been betrayed, can it ever be restored? Not always, and not by everyone. Even when the betrayal is forgiven, and the betrayed person does not want to give up the relationship, it may still, in fact, be very difficult to completely trust again. And that is the price of lying about serious matters, the loss of trust that may never be restored. Suspicion, on the other hand, the opposite of trust, undermines relationships and results in the suspicious person's misery. Let me just say that again. Suspicion, on the other hand, the opposite of trust, undermines relationship and results in the suspicious person's misery. All of us face choices. Do we, based on faith, take the risk of being misled by trusting? Or do we take the risk of not only disbelieving a truthful person, but never being able to establish close connection because of our chronic suspicion? I think he's absolutely right in what he says. I think it's, in many ways, incredibly insightful. We are living in a world where we see relationships being broken in so many ways and at so many different levels. And we're asking ourselves, can we ever trust? After the, some of you will remember, after the attacks in September 11, 2001 in the US, stock markets around the world collapsed. Now, what a lot of people don't remember is that by January 2002, they'd largely recovered. However, in the spring of 2002, we had the financial scandals of Enron, WorldCom, and some of you will be able to remember that. And the market fell further and faster than it did after what happened on September 11/01, telling you that what the market feared the most was not a terrorist attack from without, but a moral collapse from within. And this is the interesting thing when it comes about integrity in business, is we are so tempted to treat it as somehow it's simply optional, and we can make it work in the short term. But it's quite something when you realize you've been investing in the company to share in the profits, only to realize there's no profit to be shared. So we see that these things are everywhere. We can't escape from them. So I say, let me ask the questions again. Where do you get your sense of ethics from? To how big a circle do they apply? Who decides what they are? How are you applying them? Are you actually sure you've got the right ones in play? Now, the second large area I want to talk to you briefly about is pathos, passion. What is it that gets you out of bed in the morning? What is it that makes what you do worthwhile? Now, hopefully, it's more than just making money. There has to be slightly more to it than that. What is the purpose? Now, we talk an awful lot in our world about success and being successful. Now, the trouble with that word is it's a rather empty word. As a very famous Catholic thinker said, to say that something is successful is simply to say that it is. A millionaire is successful at being a millionaire. A donkey is successful at being a donkey. To simply say that something is successful, you have to ask, at what? What was the purpose in the first place? Some of you will know my colleague, John Lennox, and he has his study right next to mine, and we sometimes compare notes. And we were, a little while ago, both talking about how amazing iPads are. And I normally travel with my iPad. I haven't brought it with me on this particular trip, but it's an amazing thing. And my wife actually wants one. But personally, I believe we all have to learn how to live with a sense of disappointment. It's good for us. Now, supposing you see me with my iPad, speaking to you, and say, "Oh, Michael, I see you're speaking with one of those iPad things now. Are you having any success with it?" And I say, "Oh, yes, a lot." I said that, I own a coffee shop in Oxford, and do you know the average order in my coffee shop are 2 medium-sized cappuccinos, and the iPad Air is the perfect size from which to serve 2 medium-sized cappuccinos. I've brought an iPad Air for every member of our waiting staff, and from now on, every single coffee we serve will be served off one of those. If that was my answer to your question, are you having any success with it? You would look at me and you'll say, "Michael, I'm not sure you know what an iPad is for." Well, what are you for? What is it that you're going to use to evaluate whether you ever actually got to the place where you were meant to? The Christian author and children's writer, and actually vastly underrated because his philosophy and studying literature was absolutely brilliant, C.S. Lewis. When he talked about ethics, very famously likened talking about ethics to saying you can liken all talks of ethics to being the captain of a boat. He said, if you're the captain of a boat, he says there are 3 questions you need to answer. Number 1, how do I stop from sinking? He says, that's your personal ethics. He said, number 2, how do I stop from bumping into other boats? That's, he said, is your social ethics. But the last question the captain has to answer is, why am I out here in the first place? Those are your essential ethics. Well, what are you for? What is it that's guiding them, as both providing a fuel for your passion and also guiding them? It's very interesting. Someone once said, there is a way that seems right to someone. There is a way that seems right to a person, but the path leads to death. Some of the most tragic things we experience in this life is we're utterly sure we're on the right path. We're getting what we want and we're running for it very hard. But then there's a very sobering moment if all of a sudden the path that we've been so successfully pursuing fails to take us where we're going. It's quite something else if we don't even know where we're going in the first place. If you don't know where you're going, any road will take you there. What is it that's actually guiding and controlling and giving a direction to our passions and actually informing about what's actually worthwhile to do in the first place? Where do you get that sense from? That's why all of these questions here becomes now so fundamentally important and raise up such large issues for us. Thirdly, and finally, as we're motoring through our time, logos. Now, that word, when Aristotle used it, is the word we translate, actually it's the root of the English word logic. We use it for the word reason. It's used very famously in the Bible, in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, the logos. Now, I'm using, by the way, this outline from Aristotle very slightly differently from how he originally used it in his book, The Rhetoric. I like the 3 categories. Some of these other illustrations, he wasn't thinking about the stock market at the time, sadly. When you raise the question of logos, you're now asking an even more fundamental question. What is it that helps us give meaning to all of these things? Because we're talking about a lot of big questions at the moment. Where is it that we actually find a framework to give a meaningful interpretation? Now, one of the huge struggles that we have when it comes to ethics is that in my experience, as I meet and talk to business people all over the world, most people will say when they were young, they dreamed and imagined of leading a life where they were admired by other people when they were young. So when we're young and before we're into the midst of everything, we close our eyes and we imagine what it would be like to be a respected business person, admired, loved, because of the way in which we lived, the way in which we conducted ourselves, the way in which we handled ourselves. And as we go through life, we often find that we're making all kinds of compromises along the way that we thought we would never have to actually entertain. And then we suddenly find ourselves in a position that we never ever even thought we'd find ourselves in the first place. A couple of years ago, I was getting ready to speak to, at the time, what was the world's largest accountancy firm. And I was talking to them about business ethics. And so I thought, I'm going to get online and I'm going to watch the lectures that are being put online by the world's leading universities in this field that are free and just see what they have to say. I wasn't prepared to pay for any because I wanted it for free. And I got, I guess, what I paid for. One head of one department that I will leave unnamed, the university's not in, I'm not particularly interested in picking a fight with them personally, said something which I found remarkably controversial in one of their lectures. They were talking to a group of undergraduate students, and they said with great authority, it has been scientifically proved that people are basically good. And when you put them under pressure, they will always do the right thing. And all the students stood there nodding vigorously and writing it down. Well, I quoted this to 300 senior auditors at one of the world's largest accounting firms, and everybody sat there shaking their head going, I don't know what world he lives in, but that's not mine. That's just simply not what it looks like. That's not what it looks like. I said, let me read you something I said to them, which I think is much more insightful. This was written a long time ago by one of the world's most influential thinkers. He said this, I don't understand what I do. What I want to do, I don't do it. But what I hate, I do. And he goes on and he says, I know good doesn't dwell within me, in my inner nature. I have the desire to do what is good, but I cannot carry it out. The good I want to do, I don't do. The evil I do not want to do, I do. And everyone in the room sat there nodding. I didn't at that point tell them where it came from. Afterwards, someone put up their hand in the Q&A and said, that was fascinating. Said that description of human nature is utterly spot on. They said, can you buy it today, even though it's thousands of years old? And has anyone written something to really go deeper into it? And I said, yes, it's called the Book of Romans in the Bible, and lots of commentaries have been written on it to help you go deeper with it. This I find much more realistic to human nature. Most of the people I meet have the desire to do what is good. They dream of it. We want to be admired for it. And here now we're getting into a much deeper question. Because it's not simply enough to ask, does integrity matter? There's an even bigger question we have to ask about integrity, which is what on earth do we do when it fails? Because it will fail for all of us at some point in this room. Look, if you are sat here and you honestly believe you're perfect, the only state out of that particular self-deception, the only way out of that self-deception is to get married. We're not perfect. The human heart is a very complex thing. This world would be so easy if we could divide it into good people and bad. That would make it very easy. Alexander Solzhenitsyn came to that conclusion when he was in a concentration camp in Russia, saying if only there were good people and bad people. But that's not how it works. The human heart is a much more complex thing. My eldest daughter, she's now 18, she's about to go off and study literature and philosophy at Edinburgh University. But when she was 14, by the age of 14, she'd grown her hair all the way down to below the bottom of her spine. So she had incredibly long hair. And I was going away on a long trip, and she was talking to me, and she said, Daddy, you just need to be prepared for a shock when you come home, because when you come home, my hair's going to be a lot shorter. I was like, okay. So I didn't really think about it. A week later, I landed at the airport. I was driving home, and my wife rang me when I was still in the car. And she said, Michael, when you come home and you see Lucy, you are to say nothing except that she looks beautiful, okay, and you're happy to see her. So I knock on the door when I get home, and my daughter opens the door, and her hair's been cut off up to here. And I'm a man under authority. I do what I'm told. I say, sweetheart, you look beautiful, and it's just great to see you. Now, about 3 days later, my wife was away from home. She leads the cello section in a local orchestra in Oxford, and they were at a rehearsal. And I'm alone now with my oldest daughter watching TV, and I finally have the opportunity to ask her the question that I've been dying to ask her now for 3 days. So as we're sat there watching TV, I just start slowly breathing in and out, because I want my voice to be calm, no. And I put a smile on my face because I want it to be, this gentle question. And as calmly as I can, I turn to her and I say, what inspired the change of hairstyle? I said, were you bored? Was it fashion? Did you want something new? And she said, 6 weeks ago, I saw this documentary on TV about this charity that looks after 7- and 8-year-old girls who have leukemia. And they were saying that one of the hardest things that they find to do is to source enough hair to make wigs for the girls who lose their hair as they go through their cancer treatment. So she had a hairdresser friend come round and plait her hair in a special way and cut it off so she could mail it off to this charity so they could make wigs for some of these girls. And my daughter Lucy, she's an avid reader. She reads everything. And I know that she'd read a book called Little Women. And I don't know if you're familiar with that story, but in that story, the heroine, this very feisty young woman, she sells her hair in order to give her money so her mother can buy a train ticket to go and visit her father, who's dying thousands of miles from home in a military hospital. And as she hands over the daughter, the mother takes the money and she says, "Your hair will regrow, but you'll never be more beautiful to me than you are right now." And as Lucy told me this story, I said, "Lucy, you recently read Little Women, didn't you?" And she said, "Yes." I said, "All I can think to say is, your hair will regrow, but you'll never be more beautiful to me than you are right now." The human heart's a very complex thing, because we look into it and at times we see such beauty. And in the same heart, all mixed up with it, we see anger, greed, malice. It's all mixed up in the same heart. And that's the situation we're in. All of us find ourselves caught up with ourselves. And so it's one thing to talk about the importance of integrity. It's totally another thing to ask the question that's been asked here. What on earth do you do? If that's what we're like on the inside, what on earth do we do about it? Which is why we have to ask this question, what do we do when our integrity fails? And when we ask that question, there are three other questions that automatically flow. If your integrity fails, there are three questions you must be able to answer. You have to be able to answer them in your corporation. You have to be able to answer them in your family. As a matter of fact, you need to be able to answer them in your own life. If you don't know what to do with these three questions, you're stuck. Number one, who do I talk to? If you don't know who to talk to in your company, in your government, in your family, when your integrity fails, you're going to bury your failure and hope it goes away. But it's every time it comes back and it undermines the ground we're standing on. Who do we talk to? Number two, is there any hope? If I've really messed up in my life, is there any hope for me? Because if there's no hope and there's no way forward, again, your best bet is to bury it, hide it, deny it, hope it goes away, and that somehow it never comes to see the light of day. The third question you then need to ask, even if you know who to talk to and there's some basis for hope, you need to figure out what the process of redemption is. Is there anything that gets me out of this hole and into a different place? Now, one of the things that spoke to me very powerfully when I became a Christian were those three questions. I suddenly realized there was always someone I could talk to no matter where I was. As a matter of fact, someone who knew what I'd done even before I told him. Because that's the kind of view that God has. That actually there was hope. And the reason that there was hope was it was tied in with the process of redemption. A Christian story of that God comes down at Christmas time to make peace with us by offering us forgiveness. And to secure the means of that forgiveness by paying the price for what we've done wrong. It provides the greatest source of hope, peace, and transformation that I know, and it brings about incredible reconciliation within us, between other people, and ultimately within the society, and most directly, of course, with God himself. When we talk at the Logos question, we're not just simply looking for a word of information to tell us what to do. We actually need a word of transformation, something that's actually capable of changing and transforming who we are. And that's what we're ultimately looking for when it comes to asking questions of integrity. Those of you who were here while I was being interviewed heard that I didn't want to become a Christian when I discovered it was true, because I didn't want it to be true. I mean, to cut a long story short, because it is quite a long story, because I grew up in a culture where there was no Christian faith. When I met Christians, I was really interested by them. And we set up a group to talk about them. We suggested to this one guy that he set up a group for people to come and talk to every week about big questions in life. And we went along and discovered, to our shock, it was going to be a Christian group, which we hadn't quite figured. But it was interesting. We kept going back every week. After about 9 months, I walked in one day to his home and was looking very disappointed. I said, "Bob, what's wrong? I can tell something's not right." He said, "I've been trying to arrange for us to go away." He said, "I want us to all arrange some kind of camping trip." He says, "But all the campsites are under control of the government and they won't allow us permission." Now, half of my family in that country, we sort of are the government. Whatever we want, it's easy to make happen. So I said, "Who do you need?" He said, "Do you know the chief of..." I said, "Is the chief of police is stopping us, as is the Minister for Interior." So I went home and told my mother, "Mother, this group I joined," I said, I want to go away on a trip with it, but I'm being stopped. I said, "I need you to give me some permission." She said, "From who?" I said, "Do you know the chief of police?" She said, "Of course I know him." She said, "When I was 15 years old, he invited me to go on a date with him. Your Uncle George came, knocked out his 2 front teeth, and said if he ever spoke to me again, he would kill him. And I said, well, I need his permission. So my mother rang him up, and he immediately said, I had no idea. The family were asking if it was your son. I never would have said no. I'd have said yes straight away, of course. She hung up the phone. She said, Chief of Police says yes. Who's the other person who's stopping you? I said, do you know the Minister for Interior? She said, no problem. So we get the permission from the Minister for Interior, from the Chief of Police, and 3 weeks later we go up on this campsite. Now, on the second day of that camp, I actually became a Christian. So in my particular case, I actually organized and planned my own conversion to the Christian faith, which is slightly unusual. But one of the things that was hanging over me was a fear of hypocrisy. One of the reasons I thought my life would look worse for me was I thought, you know what, look, my standards aren't perfect, but they're okay. I'm pretty popular, I like people like me, I'm doing well, we're succeeding at everything we do, I'm happy. And now I feel like I'm suddenly going to start advocating a standard up here. That makes sense? So my standards weren't high and my life met them. But at least it wasn't hypocritical. Does that make sense? I mean, like they all met. And suddenly I felt like, what happens if I elevate the standard up here and my life is down here? That makes it worse, not better. And I was talking with someone, and as we were going through, they said, if I'm understanding what these Christians are saying properly, the fundamental heart of this decision to be a Christian is the decision to be forgiven. Now, that much I could make sense of. There were certainly things in my life I needed forgiveness for. The trouble was, I was so sure that the Christian faith would make me utterly miserable, is I walked away from the person I'd been talking to. I went and found some of my friends I'd brought to this camp. None of them were Christians. I wasn't either at that point. I said to them, I need to tell you something important. After I finish talking to you, I'm going to go and find a Christian, ask them to pray with me. I'm going to become a Christian tonight, and from now on, I'll no longer be enjoying myself. That's exactly, word for word, what I said. And that's how it felt in my heart. In my heart, I felt I was sacrificing on the altar of truth my only chance for happiness in this world. That's honestly what it felt like. It was a huge shock for me, far from sinking into a depression after I became a Christian, to actually find a new source of joy. Now, initially, I thought, I'm not going to tell anyone what happened to me because they're going to ask me all kinds of crazy questions and I'm not going to be able to answer them. So my plan was to keep it secret for 2 to 3 weeks while I thought out a good game plan of explanation for all of my skeptical friends. Sadly, in my case, that didn't work. The very next day, the first person I met, she was 6'1", she was a model, and actually was one of the other primary reasons I didn't want to become a Christian. I walked into the same room as her. She took one look at me and said, what happened to you? You've changed. And I said, I'm not sure I can explain. She said, well, try. I said, well, I became a Christian yesterday. She said, what does that mean? I said, I'm not sure I can fully explain it to you. I said, all I can say is, I know for sure I'm definitely not the person I was before. She leant forward, looked me straight in the eyes and said, would you like to sleep with me? Now, I remember looking back and saying, you know, if you'd only asked me 24 hours ago, the answer to your question would have been yes. I said, but today the answer is no. And the thing that surprised me the most was I wasn't even disappointed with my answer. It wasn't so much I was having to change what I had to do. Now someone was beginning to change what I wanted to do. If integrity isn't going to be tyrannical, if it's not going to be something that makes sense that we live in constant fear of, we need something that also is going to bring a measure of transformation and initial transformation and change to our own heart, and also provide us with answers to those other 3 questions of we need someone to talk to. We need to know there's continual hope for when we do get it wrong, and that there is a secure means of redemption that makes it possible for us to know forgiveness. And that's one of the uniquenesses that I find in the Christian faith. Well, I've now spoken to you for long enough. Thank you for staying awake, and I'll come back in about 15 minutes to answer whatever questions you have. Thank you very much.
Thank you.